we're going to be discussing the importance of having an emergency fund today. It's really relevant and topical in today's circumstances. You might have been in a position where you entered the COVID-19 pandemic, where your expenses are a lot similar in amount than your income, which means that you didn't have a lot of margin to work with in terms of spendable income. What was your options in that situation? You probably first went and looked at your investments, if you had any investments available to dig into. Secondly, you would look at your loans, your bonds. You would probably negotiate with your bank to see if you can receive a payment holiday on your payments. If that didn't work out, then you probably would have just used your credit card or your overdraft to survive, which would have meant 15 to 20% interest on the amount you borrowed. Lastly, you would probably have engaged with short-term personal loans. Now, those loans are quite toxic. You'll probably have to pay in excess of 20% interest on those type of loans. So that just illustrates why we really need an emergency fund. Firstly, we're going to talk about what is an emergency fund. The emergency fund is typically a savings account that's linked to your bank account, and it's immediately accessible. It's so important that this account is immediately accessible for you to use in an emergency. Lastly, you should be able to earn interest more than inflation on this account, which means that your check account by itself is not ideal as an emergency fund. Most people aren't aware of it, but you earn less than 1% interest on your checking or your transactional account, which really just doesn't cut it if you look at it. Secondly, why do we use an emergency fund? Earlier, I explained what were your options if you were in a position where you struggled. Firstly, you would have went to your investments. Now, typically, crisis times are times where the markets are quite down, and it won't really make sense for you to dig into your investments when the markets are down. It's almost like kicking someone when they're lying down. It just doesn't make sense. So we shouldn't do that. It will really derail your whole long-term financial planning strategy if you withdraw out of your investments in times where your investments in value is already down. Secondly, it's really no time to incur more debt. Our debt ratios in South Africa is already quite high, and it doesn't make sense for you to actually incur more debt and to indebt yourself more in this situation. How much do we need in an emergency fund? To start off with, you would need at least 1 month of your cash component. Now, cash component equals your net pay. That's after tax income, after deductions as well. And if you are married, it's probably the combined amount of yours and your spouse's income that you need. That's a starting point. If you've reached a starting point, you should aim towards 3 months of your cash component to have that available in your emergency fund. If you realize that your business or your income is affected by a pandemic like COVID-19 or in these situations, then you should even consider looking at 6 months, having 6 months worth of a cash component in that account. It's not easy to do. Not everyone can actually achieve that, but it is possible. If you plan over time, you can start saving bits into that account, and interest will also help you. What investment vehicle is suitable? I've alluded to it a bit earlier. You need an account that's linked to your bank account. Don't look anywhere else. Speak to your bank manager or your bank to consider the options that you have for the emergency fund. Typically, a money market account or a depositor account that's immediately available is ideal for your emergency fund. You can consider 32-day accounts where you have more than 1 month already saved up. So the excess above 1 month, you can save into the 32-day account. So what are emergencies? It's also very important to touch on that because a lot of people don't realize that they are actually using their emergency fund money for things that are not emergencies. Emergencies are things that happens around your home that you don't have any control over. Maybe your geyser burst, maybe your garage door broke or your electric fencing or something happened in your house and you need to take care of that. Okay, what is not emergencies? It's even more important. It's definitely not an emergency if there's a take-a-lot sale that sells something on special And we need to take cognizance of this, because we are very easily convinced if something is advertised to us. So that's not an emergency. It's not an emergency if you owe tax. You should plan for your taxes. And tax planning should be part of your financial planning. So that's not an emergency. It's not an emergency if you save for your children's education, or if you have got education requirements. That is also not an emergency. And also not is that band that's playing in South Africa for the first time, the international band. That's not an emergency. So what we're saying is not that you shouldn't pay for these things or you shouldn't actually buy them. It's just that you shouldn't utilize your emergency fund for these, because it's quite a lot of work to get to the point where you have an emergency fund available. So you don't want to then just sell out of it or pay something like I've just illustrated out of it. So today we'd like to encourage you to really consider the emergency fund and to take cognizance of how important it is to have this in place. The emergency fund will enable you to navigate through difficult times and through emergencies such as which we've experienced now recently with COVID-19, and will really help you so that you cement and you have a foundation to work off with the rest of your financial planning.